And then another question that we have from SurveyMonkey is, and this one will be directed to Layla, what can be electronically signed and what cannot?
Hi, yeah. Okay, so right now there's been a lot more flexibility on what can be electronically signed and what cannot be. And this is an exception. I think the most strict document we deal with in a hiring environment is the I-9, which is federally controlled. And oftentimes you have to physically handle documents. So even the federal government has lifted that restriction, provided that you're on a completely teleworking mode. So it's going to change from document to document, but really SCO, federal government, many different control agencies have lifted a lot of their restrictions just for this timing. Having said that, there are some requirements at the back end, like even like with the I-9, you have to come back. After you come back to work, you have 2 weeks to actually physically examine documents, etc. So yes, that leniency is there, but there's some requirements after that. So if you're in HR, just make sure you check with the control agencies. If you're a hiring manager, definitely work with your HR department and find out what practices that they're doing. Because one other thing is that you want to be consistent no matter what you do. And your HR department is going to have policies and procedures on what you can and cannot do. And they'll probably know what policy that they want to have for themselves. But like I said, there's been a lot more flexibility with the COVID-19 situation. So if you're an HR department that needs to look into it, you might want to ask around a little bit more with the control agencies about the different flexibilities. And I think before that question, I had another question about the involvement of hiring analysts in conference calls. Did we post that question?
I have not, but if that's one that you plan to answer, then we could definitely answer that now.
Yeah, so that was a question that came, was that, should hiring analysts be involved in the conference call? Again, you want to be consistent. I mean, is that your normal practice? Do you have hiring analysts involved in interviews? Maybe that's the practice that you have. Again, you should check with your HR department and your department policies as to, if that's the practice you want. But I mean, it's always a good idea to have an impartial person, and it just makes the interview all that more defensible. So again, it's going to depend on your policy, and you're going to have to check with your HR department to make sure that you're doing it consistently throughout.
Great, thank you, Layla. And I understand Jim Higgins wanted to take another shot at answering his question from earlier. So Jim, just to repeat, the question is, does the technology hinder or undermine the value of the interview in any way? So Jim, when you're ready, go ahead and respond to that.
Hello, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now, Jim. It sounds good.
You can? Oh, okay. I was unmuted, so there must have been a problem with the system. So at any rate, yes, I would say the short answer is yes. The technology does, in fact, undermine the value of the interview. The real question comes down to, can those impacts be mitigated in any way? And I think the answer to that is also yes. Basically throughout the presentations, variety of the strategies that can be employed to address those impacts have already been talked about. I just think the big thing is, know your audience. It depends on the level of the job you're interviewing for. Some people are clearly more technical than others, and they're much more comfortable with dealing with the technology, where other people, frankly, the technology is scary to them. And to the extent that you have impacts on the applicant that may negatively impact their performance, that certainly is going to undermine the value of the interview, because you're not really capturing their capabilities for the job you're trying to hire them for. Rather, you're capturing their capability of dealing with what may be an unfamiliar technology in the interview process. So there are strategies for addressing that, such as trying to make them completely comfortable as much as possible. It requires a little bit more interaction up front to answer any and all questions that they may have, providing detailed instructions, using as simple a platform as possible that doesn't require them to do a lot of anything except log in and then have the interaction. I heard someone mention that, you know, a significant amount of communication takes place using nonverbal gestures and things like that. And one of the limitations of the technology is you're basically getting a picture of a person's upper body, in some cases, just their face. And so even though we may be tempted to think that we're getting an improved version of the nonverbal communication, that may not necessarily be true as well. So, you know, by practicing the things that have been talking about, such as, you know, knowing your audience, know your technology. This is one thing. It's often the technology may be unfamiliar to the candidate or the applicant, but oftentimes it's unfamiliar to the interviewer as well. If they haven't used the technology a lot, they may not be a very good troubleshooter. And I can say for a couple of interviews that I've been on, or I know of recently, I was on one of them, my understanding, there were technical issues on both of them. And so some candidates got the video version, some candidates, we just had to settle for audio. So, you know, the more familiar you are with the technology itself, the better you would be able to adapt to that. I think that question quality becomes more critical. Like it was mentioned, focus on behavior-based questions because they're less prone to security issues. Having clear rating criteria is always important, but especially important here. And I think one of the things to be aware of are the subtle impacts that technology can have on your raters. Like I'll use the example of the interview I was on. Because the technology is becoming this sort of a middleman between the panel and the candidate, we're seeing through this small lens the candidate and not actually experiencing it up front. So any kind of technical issues, delays, poor video quality, poor audio quality, all this kind of stuff, it can have the tendency to cause the rater to almost like subtly, or they may be completely unaware of it, but it can shade their perspective of the applicant. And so the technology then can be getting in the way in such a way that it really disadvantages some applicants. And so making sure that whoever's coordinating the interview, they've prepped, you know, they've sort of coordinated the, or what I like to think of it as calibrated the raters to be able to eliminate that form of bias that comes in there. So I mean, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but yes, it does have a negative impact, but interviews themselves can have a negative impact because some people just simply don't interview well, where others really like it. And so it's just all a matter of mitigation, addressing the issues that could arise. So anyway, that's my answer.
Great, thank you, Jim. And I do acknowledge that it's now 1:01. I'm going to try to get at least one chat question in here, and maybe PTC members and I can discuss a way to try to address the other chat questions in an online format. So one of the chat questions that I have, I'd like to direct to Leslie. I feel she'd be well suited to answer this one, is to help protect interview integrity, would it be inappropriate to ask for a photo ID at the beginning of the interview? Normally, an ID check is done by the building security and compared against a visitor list before a candidate can get past the lobby. So Leslie, if you don't mind, if you'd like to speak to that one, and if anyone else wants to chime in as well, feel free.
Yeah, so, you know, in my opinion, I mean, in the interviews that we did not ask for IDs. A lot of that is because if we eventually hired the person, they were going to show up in person. And if they weren't the one that we interviewed through video conference, then that would have been pretty obvious. Now, if you're doing it over the phone, because I've been on both. I did an interview that was, these were two separate jobs, one that was just over the phone and then one that was a video conference. But over the phone, it's probably a bit more of a risk, not that you can ask for an ID over the phone anyway. But I think that, part of that is having some kind of measure when the candidate actually does start the job to confirm. I mean, if you can have something in place there, obviously, second interviews, we always encourage second interviews, and it gets harder and harder for someone to fake that over time, especially when you start to learn their voice. So short answer is I don't think you need to check for warrant ID. I mean, for us, I know like for the Department of Justice, we're checking IDs when someone comes into the building many times because we're a law enforcement agency. But in privately owned buildings, they don't always do that. So it's not like necessarily something that's always done. But yeah, that's just my opinion on that.
Great, thank you, Leslie. And I think that'll be the last question we'll have time to address. We're currently at 1:04, and I want to borrow Jim's words, be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to go ahead and conclude the webinar here. Stay tuned. We are going to release an email to those of you who registered with your emails to have a follow-up survey sent to you all, which is going to solicit some questions from you with respect to any other topics that you'd like to see from PTC in the future. And lastly, I'd like to remind you all to visit our website and join us as members through visiting our website at ptcnc.org. And so that's going to wrap it up. Thank you all again for joining us. I know these are crazy times, and hopefully this provides you all with some tools to more effectively conduct your remote interviews. So thank you all again for your time.